Welcome everyone to this week's Kumi session. On behalf of Sabeel and Kumi Now, I want to welcome you to this session on the topic of settlements and violence. This week we do have two important speakers from the organization Rabbis for Human Rights. So I see that Rabbi Donna Sharon has joined us, and I just want to welcome you, Rabbi Donna. And then your colleague Anton Goodman, I believe, will be joining us as well. I will briefly just say one thing about Rabbis for Human Rights and then allow you guys to introduce yourselves and share a little bit more about the important work that you're doing, especially since the 7th of October. But first, I also just want to say that my name is Lily. For those of you who don't know, I am working at Sabeel this year. And our director, Omar Harami, usually would be the one to be leading this webinar and facilitating with our guest speakers, but he is with a delegation from the US this week. There are, many of you know, there are 35 Presbyterians who are engaging in a solidarity visit and tour across Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Ramallah, and other parts of Israel and Palestine. So Omar is with the delegation now, and just any thoughts that you have for them as they are going around would be greatly appreciated. So I see that Anton has just joined us, and so I will make him co-host before passing the mic over to Rabbis for Human Rights. Okay. Yeah, Rabbis for Human Rights is an Israeli organization that we are really grateful to have with us today for this Kumi session. It was began in 1988 during the first Intifada, and they have been doing very important work here since then. So I'm just going to go ahead and pass the mic over to you, Rabbi Donna or Anton, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Lily, for this introduction. Are you hearing me okay? Okay, good, thanks. So hi, I'm Rabbi Dana Sharon. I'm the head of the Rabbis Network for Rabbis for Human Rights. I will talk a little bit about our organization, how it started, how it was funded, and by whom and for what reasons, and then I will touch on the subject of settlers and violence, and then I will transfer the stage to my colleague Anton, who has been exploring that particular topic for a while. So as Lily was saying, we were funded in 1988, the days of the first Intifada. I think and we are right now, first of all, one of the the only organization in Israel that is saying that human rights is a Jewish issue, that we need to be looking at it from a Jewish perspective and reclaiming the Jewish theological language and applying it to issues of human rights. As some of you maybe know from the scripture, the Jewish religion has always treated human rights is a very big deal. There's always been an aspect of deep humanism and deep care towards the other, the weakest links of society, the stranger, the orphan, the widow, are mentioned again and again in the Jewish Bible as those people who are most need looking after. And we take that very literally, and we think that it is every Jewish person's obligation to make sure that the stranger who live among us, and that was the raison d'etre of the organization when it was founded in '88, to make sure that the people who kind of share the tent with us are treated equally, are treated with respect, and their basic human rights are being kept. Things have changed since then. We're going to talk a little bit about those changes, because in '88, let me remind you, peace was very much in the agenda, it seemed, for everybody in this region and in other regions as well, which unfortunately now is not so much the case. It doesn't seem like any of our governments or many other governments around the world are looking to resolve conflicts in ways of peace. But that was very much in 88. This looked very, very solvable. So the concept of the beginning was just to make sure that while we figure out the conflict, which will take 5 to 10 years max, um, we make sure that our neighbors and the people who share the land with us are treated well and equally. In the last more than over 40 years, things have, I'm afraid, took a bit of a turn to the worse, but we're gonna get into that a little later. What I want to talk about now is the fact that we're not only the only Jewish organization who talks about Jewish rights from a Jewish perspective and in a Jewish language, we're also one of the only Jewish organizations who is non-denominational. I don't know if you notice, I'm gonna assume I don't know how many of you know Judaism, Israel, things like that, so I'm gonna assume you don't know that much. Um, and I will say that the Jewish religion has many different sects, many different streams that variate in how they practice Judaism, and in their theological and practical perception, much like Christianity, I imagine. And we are one of the very few organizations who is an umbrella organization to rabbis, Jewish leaders of faith from all the sects. So we have from the more conservative Jewish sects that see themselves more obligated to Jewish laws to Reconstruction, even secular Jewish rabbis. There is a wonderful institution that teaches that teaches rabbis, spiritual leaders on that base their authority on the secular Jewish culture and humanistic secular Jewish culture, and a lot of our members come from that area, and everything in between, conservative, reform, you name it. All of our rabbis are Israelis. That is one of our entry points. You either have to be we either have to be a rabbi who lives in Israel, or we have a few rabbis who are Israelis and are right now serving congregations overseas. But you have to have that link. You cannot be a member of this organization if you don't have very, very strong connection to Israel. We believe that this is what gives us our authority and our moral ground to speak on behalf of 100 and over 150 rabbis. I'm seeing questions in the chat. Yes, we do have Orthodox rabbis. Anton is going to be talking about that shortly. We have Orthodox rabbis and Orthodox employees. Um, we really are very committed to diversity among ourselves. Also, you have to live. Our one caveat is that you have to live in Israel, and in Israel also means not in the occupied territories. That is something that we don't permit at the moment. It varies over the years, but right now that's the situation. We refer to Israel as the original state. That is what I have to tell you about Rabbis for Human Rights. The topic of settler violence is something that we've seen. When we talk about settlers, we talk about the people who live outside the lines of 67, especially at the West Bank. That is how that term is coined in Israel. And we have seen, if I understand, Lily, correct me if I'm wrong, we are marking tonight 30 years to the massacre in the Abrahamic Mosque, which was a terrible, terrible thing that had happened and really shook, I think, a lot of assumptions people had here about how things worked almost. And we're marking that, and I think that is an interesting starter point for this conversation about violence and in this region, and it's from to the Palestinian side and its roots and its origins. And in that very unhappy note, I'm going to hand over the mic to my colleague Anton to talk a little bit about the source of that sort of violence. Anton, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dana. And I want to thank Sabil and Kumi now for hosting us for this important conversation. I'm sitting in our offices in Jerusalem. And I have to say, since the start of this tragic and brutal war, we've really found ourselves coming closer to Sabil at this time, because the messaging and the language that we're hearing from Sabil, we're realizing we have such different narratives, but we have shared values. And that's so important at these very difficult and dark days to focus on these kind of values. And so I'm happy to share a little bit more about this topic of settler violence. Maybe I'll just give a brief introduction. My name's Anton Goodman. I'm an Orthodox Jew. As I hope you can tell from my accent, I grew up in England, and I've been living in Israel for the last 20 years as a social and as a peace activist. Now, you might imagine these are difficult days for peace activists. We find ourselves in one of the bloodiest rounds of conflict, really reaching new levels of brutality and human rights abuse across the whole region. And it kicked off for us on October the 7th, which is something that is very raw in our minds. In Rabbis for Human Rights, many of the members, all of us, in fact, lost someone, a friend, family. Our colleague and director, Avi Dabush, is a survivor of the October 7th massacre. And it's something that's very high up in our minds because it's very painful, personally. And following October 7th, I went to synagogue on the Sabbath. And I went to synagogue angry. I had anger in my heart, and I went with the express intention of reminding God that he exists. And very quickly in the service, I realized how foolish and small I'd been, because I felt God, and God was still there, but the distance between us had grown, had expanded, and I still feel that distancing at the moment. And then immediately my thoughts went to the reaction. What is the Israeli state going to, how is the Israeli state going to react to the events of October 7th? And it was very clear to all of us that it was going to be a massive military reaction that we're still seeing at the moment. And then as I was in synagogue, I was thinking about the texts that we were saying, the prayers that we were reciting, and the words of the Torah, the Old Testament. Those values of struggling and searching for peace. We were reading the first book of the Old Testament, Bereshit, Genesis. You have numerous stories there about peacemaking. You have Abraham and Lot, whose shepherds are fighting on the Holy Land, and they turn to each other and they said, there cannot be bloodshed on this holy land. We should split it between us. And Abraham turns to Lot and says, which side of the land would you want? We have Jacob, who wrestles an angel all night so he can make peace with his brother Esau. What should we do with these texts now? Should we call a scribe into the synagogue to erase them from the scrolls? Or actually, do they have more value and purpose when all around us is not just war, but the calls for revenge, the calls for terrible violence? We must dig deep and look into our values. And as I was having these thoughts, very different things were happening in the West Bank, because many of the violent settler communities in Area C of the West Bank took it upon themselves to carry out revenge attacks. And we saw a spate of revenge attacks that took people's lives, that property was set fire to, really serious levels of bodily injury and intimidation. And we're left asking ourselves, how has this come about? How has it come about that this is the Jewish reaction in this kind of messianic, religious, militia-driven violence? And so we're speaking much more now about the ideology and the theology of settler violence, of where does it come from? And I'd like to present just a brief historical overview to share with you, because the worst thing that you can think is that this is a given. If you look at the last 2,000 years of the Jewish people, you'll find a people who are remarkably anti-violent, non-violent. Even if we look at the Second World War and the Holocaust, there was very few violent responses. There was the partisan movement, there was the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and for the most part, there wasn't even Jewish violence then. And in all the periods prior to that, very small amount of Jewish violence. In fact, you could classify the Jewish theology or the Jewish people before the state of Israel of being a peaceful minority, or a minority who are not looking to advance their goals through violence. And really, what's created this new breed of Judaism that we're trying to stand against, and which is really the counterpoint of the work that we're doing, is the creation of the State of Israel, which is a theological challenge to Judaism itself. And what we need to remember in the early Zionist movement, at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, this was a secular movement. There was very few religious Jews involved in it. And the reason for that was theology. The reason for that, and it still exists within the ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities in Israel and around the world, is that Jewish sovereignty on the land of Israel is something that we are told in the text of the oral Torah, the oral or the Talmud, that it is one of the signs of divine redemption, and only God can decide it. And in fact, in the tractate of Sanhedrin in the Talmud, there's an important passage which is called the Three Oaths, that talks about not taking back Jewish sovereignty, not starting to build a temple again on Temple Mount. And these are still the values held by many ultra-Orthodox Jews around the world. But there was a small contingent, a small factor of religious Orthodox Jews who were involved in the Zionist movement. But they too saw the problematic nature of returning to the land of Israel. And in fact, when Herzl suggested, I think at the 6th Zionist conference in the early 20th century, that Uganda would be a better destination for the Jewish people to escape the pogroms than the land of Israel, the only political party that voted with him were the religious Zionists, if you can believe that, because they said that the key aim is for saving the Jews who are being threatened by pogroms and anti-Semitism around the Pale of Settlement in Europe. And therefore, we should go for an option that is sustainable and go for Uganda. At the same time, a different theology was developing in the British Mandate of Palestine. And this was based in the first chief rabbi of Israel, even before the state of Israel, Rabbi Abraham Kook. And Rabbi Kook was a Hasidic Jew, a spiritual guru, a poet and a writer. And he saw within the return to the land of Israel of the Jewish people as a spiritual sign. He was not explicit what that sign exactly was, but he was very clear that this is what the divine wanted, and that the religious should work with the secular Jews together to build the state. So in the beginning, in fact, you had a religious Zionism, even as the state was created, that saw some kind of divine, will, I'd say, in the movement. This changed radically and hardened radically in 1967. 1967 and the Six-Day War, Israel made, as you know, huge land gains, conquering large swathes of land. defeating Arab armies, and the whole country, prior to the 6-Day War, many people thought Israel was going to lose that war. And so coming out of it, many people said, this is a miracle. This victory is a miracle. And in fact, that was the kind of mainstream Israeli approach to it. However, the religious Zionist movements saw what had happened, and they too said, this is a miracle. But that was not a throwaway comment. That was not some kind of metaphor. They meant, and still do, that this is the real deal, that God has come down from his chair in heaven and has made sure this victory has happened, and made sure that these lands that were part of the historic land of Israel have come back into Jewish hands. Now, theologically, that's a very radical statement or opinion to take. It's revolutionary. I mean, we haven't had a group of rabbis saying that they know exactly what the divine wants of us. And it led to radical behavior. It radicalized religious Zionism, with the religious community within Israel. It radicalized them because the rabbis started saying, you should move into these areas of land. You should try and take them away from the native population, the Palestinian population there. You should move close by. You should move to places which have historic significance. And if you notice where there are settlements in the West Bank, the most important settlements are around places of historical significance. Hebron, Shiloh, Psagot, Bethel, Eli, all of these places are mentioned in the Old Testament. That's not to say that they're the exact locations, or maybe they have been appropriated from the text. Excuse me, but it's clear that that is the connection. And what is more, they said, the rabbis turned to the population and said, don't wait for the government. Don't wait for the state. The government is now secondary. We have the voice of God leading us, and we should be doing this even if it's illegal. So the settlement movement grew out of illegality. And I'm not just talking here as we might generally talk about, international law. And we know that the settlements are illegal. And the whole occupation is illegal. But what I'm talking about is illegal under Israeli law, that there were settlers against the will of the Israeli government, against the will of the Israeli army, moving in overnight, setting up caravans and creating facts on the ground. And a remarkable number of the large settlements today in the West Bank were not government planned. They were later approved by the government in order to give either support, tacit support, direct support, or to appease political parties and the power that was growing within the religious Zionist movement. Now, someone asked the question, not all settlements of religious nature, how do they justify? It's a good question at this point, so I'm going to take it. I appreciate you asking that. There are many aspects of the settlements across the West Bank, and we're talking about 500,000–600,000 Israelis who are now living there. There are settlements that have been designed by the government and continue to expand, such as Ma'ale Adumim, Ariel, Beit Ha'elit. These are planned settlements that are aimed to be major population hubs and make some kind of strategic attempt for territorial continuity, and also to stop the possibility of a Palestinian state. When I talk about the religious settler movement, this is also a broad community. Not all of this community is violent, or far from it. And I will put that in parentheses and say that the settler movement in itself is a violent movement. We're talking about individuals who come in and attack Palestinians within their villages, but the whole sense of the settlements is violence. It's disenfranchising people from their land. It's stopping freedom of movement. It's stopping access to workplaces. It's taking away rights. So it's a violent movement. But within this, when we're talking about the violent settlers, we're actually talking about quite a small number of people. So if I said 600,000 people are living in the settlements, Our estimate is that there's about 3,000 to 4,000 among those settlers who we are putting in that category as violent settlers. As an aside, our organization doesn't always refer to it as settler violence, and within Israel especially, we use the term Jewish terrorism. We believe that this is a much stronger term. We believe that it creates an understanding that this is something that we have to really reject and fight against within our society. And so sometimes we use the word Jewish terrorism around it as well. Once these rabbis had sent their small communities starting in the early 70s to start settling, whether it's in Hebron or in Susia or in other places adjacent to Palestinian communities, you can imagine that there is almost immediate conflict between the two communities. Firstly, because the religious Zionist community, the Jewish community there, is actively trying to disappropriate the Palestinian population from their land, from their houses, from access points, or taking strategic placings. And so there's immediate conflict. And in fact, throughout our post-67 conflict, Israel-Palestine conflict, the worst parts of the conflict throughout of this, someone's putting a whiteboard, I see. Maybe we can stream that. That's not me. I just want to point out. Okay. Throughout this period, the major violence continues within the West Bank around settlements and interactions with the Palestinian population. It was during this time that those settlers who are living in the West Bank started to even further develop their theology. Not only is this the will of God, but the real aim is to ethnically cleanse this land of Palestinians and to have Jewish supremacy and Jewish sovereignty, they call it, over the whole of the West Bank. And that you start to see developed really much more strongly around 2005, when there was the disengagement from Gaza. In 2005, the settlements of religious Zionists, mainly, there was a few secular settlements as well, of the Gush Katif area, 11 settlements. 12,000 people were disengaged, were moved out of that area. As you know, this is how Israel created the open prison that is the Gaza Strip, by then surrounding it with fencing. And these populations, when it was pulled out, it was a crisis point for the theology of religious Zionism. And I remember myself being in that area in 2005, and in fact, only a week before the disengagement. And I met with settlers who hadn't packed a thing in their homes and would continue working their fields. And I said to them, well, there's a disengagement plan next week. Have you not heard about this? And they said to me, a number of them, that they didn't believe it was going to happen, that there would be a miracle, there would be divine intervention, that Ariel Sharon would have a heart attack, that the army wouldn't obey the orders, and that they would stay in place. Obviously, that didn't happen. But what it did do was it kind of activated this much more radical branch within the religious Zionist theology that has led us to where we are today. And so if we're talking about 3,000 to 4,000 violent settlers in the West Bank, they're really focused around a number of yeshivot, of religious learning establishments, where the rabbis teach them a new Torah that is based on, violence and the need for power and strength and displacing Palestinians. And then they're sent out to hilltops around the areas where they can stay, they can create more illegal settlements, they can harass their Palestinian neighbors. I'm going to speak a little bit later about the implications of the Israeli government at the moment, because we have a new government which has got members who are connected to the violent settler movement and what that's done. But what I can say at the moment is that we're seeing a huge increase in settler violence across the West Bank. According to UN statistics, it's about 3 times what it was before the war started. And even then, it was at unprecedented levels. Rabbi Dana and I and others from Rabbis for Human Rights often take part in activities and protective presence and other ways in which we can make some kind of impact on that reality. And so I've given a little bit of the historical and theological background, and I'm going to hand across back to Dana, who will talk a little bit more about our actions on the ground and how it looks. I mean, we are both in pretty regular, unfortunately, regular contact or interactions with violent settlers, and we can shed a little bit of light on this as well. So back to you, Dana.
Yeah, thank you, Anton, for this wonderful showcasing of the topic and its origins. So yeah, so what does it look like and what do we actually do? So when we talk about Jewish terror, as Anton mentioned, we talk about a few levels. Obviously, there's, you know, the higher up, the governmental level, the rezoning of the rezoning of land, all sorts of things that happen in a very on a very institutionalized level, checkpoints, etc. There's all those things that are complicated. We do what we can on those levels, but the most let's say the most urgent issue is often the day-to-day, is the fact that when a Palestinian goat herder take their goats out to the field, they are often encountered, and here again we see two things. We see either that the Israeli army come down with all sorts of questions and interrogations, which is concerning, but is not our main concern because they usually answer to some kind of authority. Our main issue is the offhand Jewish terrorists who come by to threat, to harass, to sort of show presence. That is the most common form of Jewish terror that we would encounter in our day-to-day work. So what do we do? First of all, we have a rather large protective presence program. What does protective presence mean? It means we just sort of chaperone people on their day-to-day business, usually herding sheep and goats in the West Bank, in the area of the Jordan Valley. Both the northern and the eastern part are suffering from badgering. So we just come, get there in the morning and spend our day with the shepherds and their flock, making sure that if anybody come by, we basically we use our Israeli privileges. It is very obvious from looking at us that we are activists. Also, the settlers know to look for activists. Also, they often, if you're a regular activist, they know you. They would often know our names. They often know our organizations. They keep the same way we keep tabs on them. We know who the most troubled individuals of every region are, and we know to name them by name. We often complain to the police if we can, if we have good footage, which is one of our goals, is of course to document and create, to be able to show. And this we've seen had helped when we were able to show patterns, when we are able to say at a certain point, hey, this person, and as some of you know, there has recently been some foreign governments intervening and creating giving penalties to different settlers. One of them is someone we have been monitoring. We personally, the two of us, have been monitoring for a really long time and saying, look, this is a very, very problematic individual that is using his both his authority and his he specifically, for example, uses his flock to take over land. That's something that we've been seeing happening a lot. So that is one thing that we do, this protective presence with the shepherds. What we do with the agricultural communities, again, we're talking about the West Bank, especially the Nablus region. Now, these are, I always, when I talk about our olive harvest project, I always say it's my favorite thing to do in the world, and it's the thing I wish the most I didn't have to do, because these are such beautiful communities that are working their olive groves in a very traditional way, picking up the olives often as a community, as the whole village kind of goes together and picks up everybody's olives, and then makes the oil in very traditional way, and it's just the most amazing thing to do. And I really wish we didn't have to. I really, really wish those communities would have been left in peace to work their land, to harvest their own olives, which is now impossible. They are now what used to be a very family and community oriented activity is now very much limited because of the risks, because of the risk of either a very uncomfortable in under a good scenario, it's a very uncomfortable encounter with the Israeli army. Under a bad scenario, it's a violent attack from settlers. Um, so we for the last 30 years, we've been escorting specific communities that we've created strong connections with during the time of the olive harvest. Our staff, and we have something along the lines of 700 volunteers that come and volunteer with us during the olive harvest season, and then during the olive planting season. It's also something we've been doing over the past 5 or 6 years. We give people the opportunity to purchase an olive tree, and those olive trees we take together with local activists and with local communities, and we plant them together in those olive groves, often to supplement trees that I see Anton is posting that project in the chat, and I recommend everybody to look at it because it's such a beautiful project. But for this, for example, for this planting season, and I'm sure Anton is going to elaborate what the war did to all our project in a minute, we were almost unable to get to the field to do the planting because on the one of our planting days was canceled because of rain, and then the other one was canceled because of a very direct intervention of the Israeli army that declared the specific agricultural grounds we came to plant the trees in a closed military zone from 2 in the after from 2 a.m. to 2 a.m. We were there, I think, around 9 or 8 a.m. So that was a very specific example of how our efforts are being sabotaged. And that often has to do with the fact, and this is a very specific form of institutionalized violence, is the fact that if, according to a very antique out of date law, if you don't work your land for 3 or 4 years, then the state can repossess it if it's agricultural land. And it's very easy to make it so that you cannot work your land for 3 to 4 years and then say, well, it's a no man's land and we're repossessing that. So that's something that is always on our radar. That's something that we are always trying to intervene and to stop and to make sure that this doesn't happen, that no one, that the authorities cannot say this land was not worked, and therefore we can rezone it. We're always like, no, we're here, we're showing presence, and we're enabling the local communities to show their presence to make sure that they get some access to the land and that they can prove ownership and that they can prove connection. That's a really, really big deal of what we do. So we do the olive harvest, we do the olive planting, and we do our big project of protective presence. We've also, since the war started, we found ourselves doing a lot, something we haven't done before, which is humanitarian aid. We realized so many of these communities are really, really struggling in the most basic level. So we needed to fill that vacuum and just show this very basic human solidarity and use our uh let's say larger access to movement in order to facilitate both basic food produces and some medical aid, first aid kits. That has been something really, really big that we've been working on over the last couple of months. Anton, do you want to use the time we have left to talk a little bit about current situation?
Well, I think that I'll speak for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions because there have been questions in the chat as well. And I do want to say that it's important to note that the uptick, the significant rise in settler violence is not only linked to the war. And really the watershed moment was last November when Israel elected its hardest right government really that we've ever seen. For 5 years previous to that, I was running a national campaign to try and create some kind of awareness and pushback to the rise of the radicalized religious right in Israel. Probably the most unsuccessful campaign of all time, since they came in as the third biggest party in the Knesset with 14 seats, joined the government, took senior ministerial positions, and the individuals that we're talking about who are now ministers within the cabinet are really hooligans from the streets that we've seen over the last 20 years carrying out religious-based violence, racist sentiment, all kinds of ultra-nationalist behavior. And just the very fact that they entered into positions of power really strengthened the hand and acted as a tailwind to the settler violence. And so almost immediately we saw higher levels of settler violence. And we should remember that the unprecedented major settler attacks that we saw in May and June of 2023 in Hawara, in Tormusaya, we've never seen these kind of attacks before. Hundreds of settlers descending on towns and burning houses with families in them. That happened because of the government that we have in power at the moment. Not just the dog whistle of these people being in power, but their active policy. And Itamar Ben-Gvir, as the Minister for Internal Security, which is surreal to see a hooligan and a criminal like him taking this position of the Minister of the Police, has a clear policy that he's told the police don't arrest violent settlers. So when we're in the field, we continue to call the police and the Israeli army and demand that they fulfill their responsibility to protect the population. But we know now that they're not going to be responding or arresting settlers because of this government. As I said, October the 7th and the start of this terrible war and the bombardment of Gaza opened an even worse situation within the West Bank. And we've seen over 800 Palestinians who have been forced off their land by settler violence. Now, in the past, we've seen Palestinians forced off their land. It's not a new thing, but often it was done by military order, legal order. In this case, the state of Israel did not decide anything. It was violent settlers with intense campaigns of violence and intimidation who succeeded terribly in removing people on lands that they lived on. We're talking about herding communities mainly, who've been on these lands 60 years, 100 years, been moved around the area. Small groups of families, we're talking about, 18, 30 families in different places, forced off their lands. And we followed these communities and we see where they're living now. And I'm shaken to think of the community of Wadi Asik. It's not spoken about so much. Small community of 30 families that was forced off its land after October the 7th. And today, many of those families are living in a valley near the town of Taiba in the West Bank, which is totally inappropriate because they're suffering from the elements. There's so much mud, they can't even get out of the valley on tractors. And there's water flowing into their tents. This is a human rights abuse that we cannot stand by quietly. So we continue to bring humanitarian aid to these communities and to provide protective presence as needed. And so we're facing a very difficult situation on the ground. And I'm aware that we've got a little time left. So Lily, maybe I'll hand back to you and we could take a couple of questions before our time is up.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you for the historical background that you've provided, as well as the current updates, particularly on hearing about the work you're doing in protective presence and with the olive planting projects. I would encourage everyone to continue put questions in the chat, but maybe just to ask a question that summarizes a few of the things that have come up. You mentioned that one of the key aspects that makes Rabbis for Human Rights unique is that all the rabbis and staff involved are connected to Israel or are Israeli citizens. What sort of work then does Rabbis for Human Rights do on an advocacy scale that's more internationally? Because we've had a few questions about positions engaging with US and Europe. So yeah, what work does Rabbis for Human Rights do in general, and what has been addressed since the 7th of October?
So I'll jump in and say on the international stage, we do present briefings to diplomats and to journalists. But really our focus is about bringing a human rights-based discourse to Jewish identity in Israel. That's our main focus. And so, we have a network of 150 rabbis and rabbinical students who are all Israeli and members of the organization. And we encourage them to come and take part in activist events, to come to the ground and to write about it and to speak in the Israeli media. And that's something that we've had some success with, because it's, for the Israeli public, it's interesting, or it's maybe a curiosity to see rabbis behaving in this way. And so I mentioned the terrible settler attack on Tor Mosiah and Hawara. And the next day, to both places, we had a rabbinic delegation of 15 rabbis to Tor Mosiah, 20 rabbis to Hawara, who came in to express solidarity with the families, to hear their stories, to see them, and to express the need for human dignity and, punishment for the people that had done this. And an Israeli journalist heard we were doing this and joined one of the visits, and it turned into a 15-minute segment on the most watched nightly news that night. And that's the potential we feel of having rabbinic voices within Israeli society, trying to act as a moral compass on these issues that are often brushed aside under the carpet, or that people have willful ignorance about even seeing that they're happening at all.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe the next question, the most recent one in the chat, as far as, do you feel you're a drop in the ocean given the nature of your views? And maybe Rabbi Donna, you could take this and also just talk about your tradition theologically and Reform Judaism, and how does this measure up to the discourse?
Of course. Yes, I mean, I don't wanna sugarcoat it. Yes, I think we do feel often like a drop in the ocean. And I think that's something what we've been getting a lot from our members, that a lot of them are feeling alone or isolated, like they're, carrying this, saying these truths nobody really want to hear, necessarily. There's a lot of, like Anton said, there's a lot of willful ignorance, within the Israeli public about what the reality of the occupation, what it actually looks like, it's very easy not to know. Nobody's gonna necessarily tell you unless you actively seek the information. We see that a lot when we work with gap year programs here in Israel. We give them a lot of tours and a lot of teachings, and you can just see that people are being kept very much in the dark. And it's very easy not to know. Even people who are politically aware and engaged, this is kind of, it's like this, for a lot of people, it's like this bit of an alternative universe almost. They just don't know. We see, again, this is something we see with our rabbis, that there's just a lot of gaps in information. So we do feel like we're a bit of a drop in the sea, but I can say what Lily, you asked me about my perception and my theology. My theology, that I think leans a lot about Jewish teachings, is the fact that we have to keep our moral compass even in the darkest of times. We have to stay, we have to values and stance are for trying times, not for times when everything is, it's easy. It's very easy to be pro-human when, you know, I don't know, when you live in a place where there's no conflict. Staying really committed to taking care of the stranger amongst you when those strangers might be extending that kind of courtesy to a population that might not be viewing you under the same of circumstances. To me, that's real power. To me, that's real faith. To me, that's how I stay true to myself. Anton was talking about October 7th and about how we've all had it impacted us differently. One of the people I loved most in the world was gone that day, and was taken away from me. My values are not going to be taken away from me. My belief that we can, need, and should do better will not be taken away from me. My belief that all lives are sanctified, even lives of people who choose to take life are still sacred, and that decision belongs to God only under most circumstances, will not change. All human lives are sacred and holy, and unless under very, very trying circumstances, I think we should do our best to preserve all of them. That's my theological stand, and I plan on keeping it, and I plan on keep protesting against the war crimes that Israel is now committing, and I'm gonna keep advocating that everybody in this region deserves better governments. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. And I appreciate just the personal aspect that you yourself can bring into this, and certainly have authority to speak theologically to it. And I think that that's probably the best and strongest note to end this presentation on this evening. So I just want to thank both of you so much for being with us on behalf of Sabil and on behalf of Kumi. The majority of our audience, I would say, are Christians, and so it's always good to have interfaith perspectives and to hear from a rabbi and from this organization. And we look forward to continuing to follow the important work that you are doing, both on the ground and theologically. So yeah, on behalf of all of us, just thank you, Rabbi Donna and Anton, for being with us. Yeah, and blessings on you.
Thank you so much for having us, and thank you for your partnership. Like Anton was saying, Sabil has just been this huge beam of light in our lives over the recent month, and we look forward to keep on our fruitful partnership and collaborations.
Thank you so much. Only best wishes.
Thank you.
Best wishes and good evening or good day, depends on where you're joining us from.
Excellent. At this time, Kumi Action will have about 5 minutes to dedicate to that. So transitioning from the educational portion of our Kumi session tonight to action. And so if Ryan is able to share with us our actions for the week, we will not be breaking into breakout rooms or anything, but just going to briefly explain the actions that were sent out in our newsletter yesterday to give you all some guidance as you complete those. We still do have the worldwide action, which is the same as the past few weeks as we're in the season of Lent for organizing the Gaza ceasefire pilgrimages. So I would encourage you to continue to look at that. Then as far as our other regional actions, we have for the UK, and this is just what Ryan has put in the chat, everything is there with the links. This week we have a new action for the UK, which is the Parliament tomorrow will be voting on whether the UK should call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. So there is a link there for those who's relevant for you. In the US, it's continuing to demand a ceasefire. And also just today, the US vetoed again another UN Security Council resolution. So I would encourage you all in your letters that you're writing to add that as the most recent update. That we continue to veto these resolutions. So asking your representatives and contextualizing that with the most recent updates. Then for Canada, we have the defunding the Israeli military petition, which closes this week on February 24th. So those of you in Canada, we invite you to fill out that petition. And then the worldwide action, we want to thank Ir Amin, which is an organization that is on the ground here in Jerusalem. It's doing very important work to ensure that it is a sustainable city for Israelis and Palestinians. So the links for looking into Ir Amin and learning more about them as well are present. All of the actions are available in the newsletter that you should have received yesterday. And then with that being said, we just, thank you all for being on the call tonight and continue to learn more about the work that Rabbis for Human Rights is doing. Thank you all for being here and continue your work and your advocacy and action. As people are just logging off, I'll hang around for 1 minute. If there's any questions on completing any of the actions, feel free to put them in the chat at this time. I haven't checked it myself, Alice. Are you having issues with the Canada petition?
I had already sent it to my son and daughter-in-law who live in Canada, and I'm looking at it now, and it seems to have closed yesterday.
Oh, it closed yesterday.
So it's closed, unfortunately. And maybe there's another petition that's available. I was hoping.
And can I give a little bit of feedback from the UK homework?
Sure.
I did mine yesterday, and I still got an email back saying that they required my phone number as well. So when you're filling in the UK, add also your postcode, not only your address, but your postcode and telephone number to make sure they bother to read it when it gets there. Yeah, did you get that? Did people hear that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
noted. Thank you. Thank you, Dorothy. And thank you, Alice, for pointing that out about the petition. We'll try and make sure they're updated going forward. Okay, if that's everything, yeah, thanks again for those of you who stuck around, and we'll see you next week for Kumi.